Chapter 1: Ancient Battle. Sean gazed out the window at the goalposts, their towering frames standing like a giant H against the dull, overcast sky. He imagined himself on the field, flawlessly striking the ball through the uprights every time. It was a vivid picture in his mind. Meanwhile, the classroom buzzed with chaos. What had begun as an innocent discussion had erupted into a heated debate. The battle of the sexes was always bound to stir emotions, especially with a group of teenagers full of energy and opinions. Sean, however, had yet to be pulled into the argument. Instead, his thoughts were with the Gaelic football legends he admired. His late father had instilled in him a deep love for the game, and though Sean knew every detail about it, his physical skills on the field didn't quite match his passion. When it came to competing with his peers, he always came up short. After all, it was a game for the tough. Tomorrow, the school would face off in the cup semi-final, though Sean wouldn't be playing. His knowledge of the game had earned him the title of Morius, water boy, not a glamorous role, but it meant he could travel with the team, watch the match, and miss a few classes, including fifth-year Honours Irish, the site of the ongoing debate. Men are like copiers, you need them for reproduction, but that's about it. Men are like parking spots, the good ones are already taken, and the rest are either handicapped or too small, came the mocking response. Careful, Sinead. Ms. Sullivan, the Irish teacher, warned. Men are like newborn babies, cute at first, but you quickly tire of cleaning up after them. The battle was tipping in the women's favor, as usual, especially in a class with 18 girls to only 3 boys, all under the watchful eye of Ms. Sullivan, known for her feminist views. Hey, help us out, egghead. Fergal's ruler slapped against Sean's back, pulling him out of his daydream. Things had gotten intense while he zoned out. Why did God create man before woman? One voice asked. Everyone needs a rough draft first, someone else joked. To do something with the leftovers. Barry sneered. I think it was so men could enjoy heaven on earth for a moment, said little Mickey, trying to defend his gender and avoid another ruler smack. The glares turned on Mickey, but his relief was short-lived. Fergal fired back with the classic, why are women's feet smaller? So they can stand closer to the sink. Barry added with a punchline that had the room erupting in laughter. Dirty bitches. High fives followed. They loved being that clever. Just then, the bell rang. Queenies. Ms. Sullivan regained control of the class. Since everyone seems to have an opinion, I want an essay titled Na Na Arian, Saeliska? Women of Ireland, Easy Life, she announced. And boys, drop it off tomorrow morning. The match is no excuse. The class was already halfway out the door. As Ms. Sullivan packed her things, Sinead approached her, fuming. That wasn't fair, Ms. Sullivan. Are you going to let them get away with that filth? Sinead was a force to be reckoned with. Prefect, captain of the All-Ireland winning girls basketball team, outspoken leader, and the head of a failed campaign to introduce trousers into the girls' uniform policy, she wasn't afraid to challenge authority. I do not, was Ms. Sullivan's curt reply. Chapter 2: The Assignment. Sean tossed the crumpled pages into the trash, his second attempt at the essay now discarded. It wasn't going well. He was usually a good student, never struggling with homework, but this task was different. The first draft had been a scathing attack on women, he'd gotten carried away after the heated discussion in class. The comments had been directed at him too, but he couldn't bring himself to submit something so harsh, so it too had found its way into the bin. He had always been surrounded by women. Since his father's passing, they were his world, his mum, 2 sisters, aunt, and cousin. His aunt had become pregnant young, her boyfriend had abandoned her, and his parents had taken her in, even though his mother was pregnant with him at the time. When his father died in a building accident, Sean was left as the only male in the family. He never minded living with the girls, and he knew life wasn't always easy for them. Sean had always been expected to pull his weight. Even when his dad was around, he insisted that Sean share in the household chores. "What kind of man can't even cook or clean for himself?" his dad would say. And while his dad wasn't afraid to wear the apron when his mother was sick, he also made sure to maintain the illusion that he never did any of the hard work. After his dad passed, Sean's chores multiplied. Sometimes he felt his aunt resented him, piling even more responsibilities on his shoulders. He never knew if it was because of her own difficult experiences with men, or if she thought he was being overly spoiled. After all, his mother often treated him with extra care. He had been a sickly baby, which explained his smaller size, and he'd lost his father far too young. His second essay attempt had turned into a piece in praise of women. As he read it over, he realized there was no way he could submit it. The risk of Ms. Sullivan reading it aloud to the class was too high, and with his history as a good student, that was almost certain to happen. Sure, Barry wouldn't get it, his Irish was terrible, and it was a mystery how he managed to stay in honors Irish, but Fergal would. Fergal was sharp, if a bit crude and lazy, and the last thing Sean needed was for the guys to start calling him soft or worse. For his third attempt, he decided to play it safe. He balanced his arguments carefully and took a neutral stance, placing himself firmly on the fence. That was the safest option, he thought. With the essay done, he packed his bag, his minor dilemma solved. Now, he could look forward to the match tomorrow and the upcoming trip to the Gaeltacht. Chapter 3, The Fates Conspire. 3 o'clock turned out to be a pivotal moment in Sean's life, though he had no way of knowing it at the time. As the game kicked off and he darted around the field, providing water to the players, a different kind of drama was unfolding in Ms. Sullivan's Irish class. While the game spiraled out of control for his school team, the fates of those absent students were being decided in the classroom. A lesson needed to be taught, and Ms. Sullivan's girls were more than ready to deliver it. Meanwhile, chaos reigned on the pitch. With the team trailing and any hope of recovery fading, Fergal, frustrated and desperate, turned to his old fallback, violence. As his opponent sprinted past him, Fergal swung his elbow with brutal precision, breaking the player's jaw. He paused long enough to stomp on the fallen man before heading straight for the showers, uncaring of the red card that should have followed. With one player sent off, the team's hopes were dashed, and shame would be their only companion as they left the field. As the final whistle blew, so did the school bell. Both events had their own decisive outcomes, neither of which were good for Sean. As the girls left with wicked satisfaction, Ms. Sullivan stayed behind. Her phone buzzed, quickly bringing her up to speed on the disgraceful actions at the sports field. Fergal wasn't just facing suspension from all GAA activities, he wouldn't be attending school for the foreseeable future either. He was already under investigation for vandalizing Ms. Sullivan's car, the word "leather" scratched into the side. Well, that was one less issue to deal with on her upcoming trip to the West. She sorted through the pile of assignments, starting with Barry's. The single page was enough to confirm her expectations, another fail for Barry. He'd been warned multiple times before, and now someone else would miss out on the trip. Feeling somewhat satisfied, Ms. Sullivan thought about the girls' plan. Grabbing her phone, she dialed her friend, Mrs. O'Brien, the head of Colaced Brid, where the girls would be heading. "That's right, Mrs. O.B. We don't need accommodation for boys. It's just me and 19 girls, those are the final numbers." The plan was in motion. As she continued correcting the essays, she eventually came to Sean's. His essay made her pause. It was solid work, the kind of effort she appreciated. Sean had always been one of the few boys who never gave her trouble. However, his involvement in the class debate, siding with the chauvinistic comments, hadn't gone unnoticed. The girls had demanded their revenge, and what harm could a little lesson do? She thought it might actually benefit him. Reading between the lines, she imagined he might even enjoy it. Chapter 4, Into the West. Friday morning flew by for Sean and the girls of Miss Sullivan's Honors Irish class. The school buzzed with talk about the football scandal, and speculation was rife that Fergal wouldn't be returning to school. This news came as a relief to Sean. He had feared for his health, dreading weeks of living with Fergal, but now that burden was gone. Barry would still be there, but he was just a fool, and without Fergal's influence, he figured he wouldn't be much trouble. Sean hoped to make some new friends at the college anyway. At the pickup point, Sean learned that Barry wouldn't be joining them. No big loss, he thought. He had enough friends among the girls, having taken all honors subjects, which meant he overlapped with most of them in his classes. He knew them well, and though they were still a bit sore over the battle of the genders, Sean had barely participated, so by the time they reached the college, it would all be forgotten. Sean would be the only boy on the trip, a role he was used to. He didn't realize, however, that no one had actually planned for him to make it to the Gaeltacht at all. Ms. Sullivan instructed everyone to leave their bags for the coach driver to load, and soon they were on their way. Sean took a seat near the front, thinking proximity to Ms. Sullivan would offer him some protection in case there was any tension. As they passed through the beautiful Midlands and into the west, with its drumlins, bogs, lakes, and rivers, Sean's eyes grew heavy. Soon, he succumbed to sleep. He awoke to the sound of giggling and Ms. Sullivan's voice. "Girls, what have you done?" Confused, he opened his eyes to see a circle of faces grinning at him. "How's he going to manage with hardly any eyebrows?" one girl teased. "It's all right, Ms. We can lend him makeup to draw his own," another chimed in. Howls of laughter followed, and Sean's stomach churned. He'd fallen victim to one of the oldest adolescent pranks. His eyebrows had been shaved off, leaving him with nothing but smooth skin where they once were. And the worst part? Not a single whisker had yet sprouted on his chin to make up for it. So much for teacher protection. The crunch of gravel under the tires signaled their arrival. Sean looked out the steamed-up window through the pouring rain and saw a row of beautiful houses by the sea. These must be the girls' accommodations, he thought, hoping his place would be just as nice. "Everybody off and grab your bags," Ms. Sullivan called, giving Sean a playful pat on the head. "You too, a store." Sean trudged out into the heavy rain, his search for his bag quickly turning frantic. Before long, it became clear that his bag was nowhere to be found. Soaked through from looking, he watched as most of the girls had already walked off to their houses, about a 10 to 15-minute walk away. A drenched, miserable Sean turned to Miss Sullivan, who smiled and reassured him, "Don't worry, a Croy, come on up to Mrs. O'Brien's. We'll sort something out." They ran the rest of the way, where they were met by Mrs. O'Brien, who greeted them with a grin. "Go before dia or in. And creature balked. God save us, poor creature." Before long, Mrs. O'Brien had Sean upstairs, where she sent him into the shower while she whisked away his drenched clothes. Chapter 5, Sierra. As Sean stepped out of the shower, a sudden realization hit him: he had a problem. His clothes were nowhere to be found, and without his bag, he had no spare clothes to change into. Wrapping a large bath towel around himself, he made his way toward the door, not wanting to give any strangers an unwanted glimpse. Hesitantly, he called out, "MS. MS. Can you come here for a minute?" Miss Sullivan climbed the stairs to his room. Miss, I have no clothes now." She stifled a small laugh. As Gaelge, she reminded him, emphasizing that he needed to speak in Irish for the entire stay. "Nil aon edai agam," he repeated in the proper language. A gleam appeared in Ms. Sullivan's eye. "ACH," she said with a smile, promising she would find something for him and that she'd be right back. Sean returned to the bathroom and looked at his reflection in the mirror. There he stood, a scrawny excuse for a boy. He inspected the remnants of his eyebrows and pushed back his shoulder-length hair. His family's financial situation had meant he hadn't had a haircut in ages. Looking at himself, he realized he looked strikingly like his sister, which made him feel unexpectedly homesick. This trip was quickly turning into a nightmare. A knock at the door jolted him from his thoughts. Ms. Sullivan had returned with instructions for him to get dressed and meet them downstairs. "Circo lure," he sighed, going to the door to collect his new clothes. When he opened the door, he found a denim skirt, ankle socks, underwear, a pink top, and matching pink trainers waiting for him. There had to be a mistake, but there were no other clothes in sight. He sat there, bewildered, until he heard Ms. Sullivan's voice calling him again. Sean had worn some of his sister's hand-me-downs before, anything to save money, but those had never been this overtly feminine. With no other choice, he reluctantly pulled on the knickers and top, stepped into the skirt, and bravely headed downstairs. Taking a deep breath, he stuck his head around the door and meekly asked about the mix-up with his clothes. Ms. Sullivan invited him in, saying there was something they needed to discuss. As Sean entered the room, he could feel his cheeks burning with every step. The sound of muffled giggles met his ears, which felt as deafening as a waterfall in his mortified state. He focused on his new pink trainers, trying to avoid the eye contact that would only emphasize his humiliation, but their very brightness reminded him of his situation. Ms. Sullivan began speaking. Sean, still reeling from shock, had to adjust his focus first, because she was speaking in Irish, and second, because he was still processing everything. The situation, as Ms. Sullivan saw it, was this: they had two problems. Two. Sean thought, wondering if he had heard that right. His bag, it seemed, had never made it as far as the bus. He was already well aware of that. But now there was another issue. Mrs. O'Brien had checked all the houses, and none of them had been expecting a registered boy. Sean's heart sank even further. Could things get any worse? At that point, he wouldn't have minded going home, but the thought of the hard-earned money wasted made tears well up in his eyes. Ms. Sullivan continued, assuring him that she had gone around to the girls and gathered enough clothes to see him through. He wondered if none of them had jeans, but at least his own clothes should be dry by tomorrow. As for the accommodation issue, Ms. Sullivan had a solution. Although there was nowhere near the college that had space for a boy, Mrs. O'Brien had a spare bed in the girls' room. Looking at Sean, she added with a smile that there was always room for one more Kaylin. "Sierra!" Sinead exclaimed. "Doesn't it suit her?" Chapter 6, Making the Girl. The two women discussed in detail how things would unfold. It seemed Sean wasn't expected at the college, but as luck would have it, a mystery girl had failed to show up. They'd agreed that Sean, or rather Sierra, would take her place. This meant that over the next few weeks, Sierra would attend classes with the girls and participate in all their activities. Since Sierra would need to dress as a girl for the duration, and the other girls had generously donated more than enough clothing, it solved the lost luggage issue as well. Two problems solved with one solution. How convenient. "All right, Missy. Let's get you sorted." Sierra was led back upstairs to her new room. On the bed lay a massive pile of clothes, and it was immediately clear what kind of clothing it was: feminine, with not a pair of pants in sight. It seemed Sierra was about to be transformed into the girliest of girls, as that was the type of clothes her peers had eagerly given up. "Looks like she missed a spot in the shower, Ms., one of the girls remarked, pointing to the fuzz on Sierra's legs. The consensus was clear: everything had to go, including underarm and body hair. Before long, Sierra found herself back in the shower with a lady shave and foam. It didn't take much to figure out what to do, and soon, her eyebrows weren't the only part of her body that had been visited by the razor. Emerging from the shower, she found a bottle of moisturizing lotion and began treating her skin. As she looked at her legs, they no longer seemed like her own, but instead like those of a porcelain doll. The tingling sensation confirmed they were indeed her legs, though she wouldn't admit that she found the transformation somewhat enjoyable. When she reached for her previous outfit, she discovered the addition of a 36B bra. Her new figure was now complete, according to her peers, and some socks for stuffing gave her the shape she needed. With her tiny waist and new curves, she was beginning to take on a very different form. Minutes later, she was at the mercy of the girls' frenzy. "Time to finish those brows," one girl exclaimed. "I have wonderful plans for her hair," another added. "I'm claiming the makeup," someone else shouted. Over the next few hours, Sierra resigned herself to her fate. She quietly allowed the girls to mold her into her new self, the house mascot, the house doll. Once the whirlwind finally died down, she was presented with the final result. Makeup, clothes, perfect hair, and delicate arched brows. As she stared into the mirror, her sister's image came to mind once again. But now, she wasn't just looking at her sister. She was staring at her reflection as Sierra, the somewhat pretty girl who now stared back at her. Sean had all but vanished. Chapter 7, Breakfast. Sierra woke early, the luxurious feel of fresh sheets against her smooth legs reminding her of her transformation. She could hear soft murmurings, and soon the room was filled with lively, girlish chatter. A pink terry robe was tossed her way to cover her pink nightdress, as pink had been chosen as her color. She slipped it on and headed downstairs to breakfast with the other girls. As the fog of sleep lifted, nerves began to take over. How could she continue pretending to be a girl for the entire stay? Surely, someone would figure it out. She had to be cautious, that much was certain. Last night, she'd been drilled in feminine behavior and deportment. She'd already crossed her legs unconsciously, and years of living with girls had likely taught her a thing or two, but the fear still lingered. Her plan last night had been to throw on her own jeans and t-shirt as soon as possible, so she could at least be comfortable in her own clothes. But now, she questioned whether that was the wisest choice. The jeans might make it easier to blend in, but they could also make slipping up too easy. What should she do? Her decision was made for her when a loud commotion erupted in the backyard. Mrs. O'Brien could be heard shouting a string of colorful curses. The girls all rushed to the window just in time to see the poor woman collapse while chasing after the family goat. The billy goat made a quick getaway, turning to mock his pursuer. In the brief moment of the goat's retreat, Sierra caught sight of what was left of a pair of denim jeans, now the goat's breakfast. That confirmed it, she would be wearing skirts for the duration of the trip. Like everything else that had gone wrong so far, there was nothing to do but accept it. She sat at the table, absently playing with her soda bread and strawberry jam, hardly able to drink her tea, let alone eat. Before long, she was ushered away from the table, her attire chosen by the girls who had masterminded her makeover. With little energy left, she dragged herself down the road, dismally following the other schoolgirls. Chapter 8, College Days. When they arrived at the college, the students were quickly divided into their classes, briefed on the schedule, and informed of the rules and expectations. Sierra sat quietly, more aware of the way her skirted legs were exposed than anything being said. But no one seemed to give her any extra attention. She was observed by the girls and eyed by the boys, but it was nothing out of the ordinary for any teenage girl. She wasn't sure if she should be relieved by how well she blended in, but at least she didn't have to endure any pointing or mocking. The first activity was a getting-to-know-you session, and Sierra was paired with two girls from another school, Fiona and Orla. They were all shy at first, and the language barrier didn't help, but before long, they were chatting as best they could. Both Fiona and Orla were very kind, with Orla being the more outgoing of the two. They quickly discovered many common interests in music, books, and TV shows. Sierra began to relax, there was nothing here she couldn't handle, and any awkwardness in the conversation could be chalked up to the language gap. Less than 24 hours had passed, and Sierra was already starting to feel like one of the girls. At lunchtime, Sierra stayed to eat with the girls, enjoying their company. As they reviewed the afternoon schedule, they saw that the first sporting activity would be Gaelic football. Sierra allowed herself a small smile. Fiona wasn't too sure about the sport, she didn't really like it, but was hoping the other girls would help her out. They agreed to meet at the pitch later, so the girls went back to their houses to change. Sierra was back in shorts, at least, though the delicate legs that emerged from them did little to restore any sense of masculinity. To her surprise, Sinead and a few of the other girls from her school were also playing, and they were on the same team as Fiona, Orla, and Sierra. The girls lined up at the gate, waiting for the boys of Collaist Podrig to finish their game. When the final whistle blew, the boys charged past, eager to show off their physical prowess. Their behavior was encouraged by their coach, the notoriously sexist Mr. Clancy, who was the last one out of the gate. He couldn't resist making a comment. Girls playing football, he scoffed. What's next? He laughed. Grabbing Sierra by the shoulders, he added, such a pretty thing, much more suited to the rows of Turley lads. He laughed again as he joined his group. Sierra blushed. She had seen the famous Kerry beauty pageant on more than one occasion with her sisters and cousins, and now she was being compared to one of its participants. In the space of a day, her whole world had flipped. On the field, Sierra began to find her stride. Years of practicing her skills were now paying off, and she wasn't intimidated by the sheer strength of her opponents, thanks to the non-contact nature of the women's game. She started to build a rapport with Sinead, the cornerstone of their team. The game was intense, with both sides fiercely competing. As the final whistle neared, Sierra's team was 2 points behind. Only a goal worth 3 points could save them. Sinead had won the ball at midfield and passed it to Sierra. Feigning right and left, Sierra glided past her opponents, the goal opening up before her. Her dream of glory was within reach, a well-placed kick, and the game would be hers. But just as she was about to take the shot, she spotted Fiona in a better position. With a swift decision, Sierra passed the ball to her. Fiona, shocked at the opportunity, gathered it and, though her kick was more of a gentle tap than a strike, the ball trickled over the line. It was a goal, and Fiona was the heroine, securing the win. As the girls congratulated Fiona, Sinead approached Sierra. "Hey, chick," she said, and Sierra could feel more warmth than sarcasm in the nickname. "I saw what you did there, babe. That was cool, really sweet." She smiled. "I really enjoyed playing with you, you're all right, hun." Sinead winked. "We're playing Kamaji later this week. I'm calling dibs on you for my team, girl, and you'll look so cute in that little skirt." Sierra should have been upset, but she wasn't. She could only laugh. Chapter 9, Little Helper. After a long day at the college, the girls headed home for the evening. Sierra even found herself with a little skip in her step as she walked back. Despite her worries, the day had turned out better than expected. When they reached the house, a chores rota was posted on the door. The girls rushed over to check it, letting out audible moans and groans as they read their assignments. Sierra took a look at the list, and to her surprise, it wasn't as bad as she had imagined. She was on chores right away, but at least it wasn't as overwhelming as the duties she had back home. She noticed she seemed to have more tasks than the others, but she figured she'd check that later. For now, she was happy. She'd made new friends and had fun, even if it meant wearing a skirt. Nothing could spoil her good mood. Mrs. O'Brien was waiting in the kitchen, ready for Sierra to lend a hand. In truth, she had expected to have to go find her, as Miss Sullivan had warned her about some boys who needed a lesson. But to her surprise, the girl who walked in was smiling, the only one left of the original tricky trio. Mrs. O'Brien quickly listed the tasks she needed help with, and was taken aback when Sierra got to work, performing each task with ease, as if she were an expert. She had expected a kitchen novice, but instead, she was met with someone who seemed right at home. Mrs. O'Brien blinked in disbelief when Sierra started humming softly to herself. Surely, this wasn't the insensitive thug she had anticipated. As the tasks were completed and the heat of the kitchen did its work, Mrs. O'Brien took the chance to have a conversation with Sierra. She started by asking about the day's events and was surprised to hear that Sierra had enjoyed herself, even in a skirt. As the day went on, she had mostly forgotten about her attire. Sierra told her about her new friends, the match, and how she was looking forward to tomorrow. Before long, Mrs. O'Brien found herself listening to the girl's life story, even wiping away a tear as it unfolded. This wasn't a rogue, she thought, this was a sweetheart. Suddenly, guilt crept in. She had originally planned a harsh routine to tame the girl's ego, but now, she realized that it wouldn't be necessary. "That rota," Mrs. O'Brien began, "it's just a first draft. Not every Sierra is like you, dear. I just have to fill in some of those spots yet." Sierra smiled. This day was turning out even better than she'd hoped. Go on and call the rest of the girls for dinner, a store. Though I must admit, I fear they won't be as good a little helper as you. Chapter 10, Education continues. Sierra hung the tea towel on the dresser, said goodbye to Mrs. O'Brien, and headed off to relax for the evening. As she climbed the stairs, she found the girls waiting for her. "Hey, girlie," they cooed, and something told Sierra that maybe she should make a quick escape. But any attempt to retreat was blocked, and she was gently but firmly ushered into the bedroom. "You put in a fine performance today, Missy," they told her. "But it's been decided that there's always room for improvement." Sierra had thought her lessons for the day were over, but she was wrong. She was about to be enrolled in the Gaeltach's very own ladies' academy and finishing school for girls. Her roommates had decided that dressing a boy in the morning was a task they could do without. Given their love of duvet time, they figured Sierra would have to learn to pick out her own outfits and do her own hair and makeup, and the sooner, the better. Plus, these sessions helped fill what would otherwise be a dull evening when TG4 had nothing interesting to offer. Sierra had often watched the women at home go through their beauty routines, but she had never realized how much went into it. Makeup 101 opened up a whole new world to her. The girls presented her with a new makeup bag filled with essentials. She was told that her collection should never lack concealer, foundation, eyeliner, mascara, eyeshadow, blush, loose powder, lip liner, lipstick, gloss, and lip balm. At that moment, Sierra barely knew what half of those things were, but by the end of the night, she had a pretty good understanding. She did well with the theory, learning how to hide a pimple, the difference between liquid, cream, and powder foundations, and the best way to apply eyeliner, starting from the inside corner of the eye and working out. She even learned the best method for removing mascara, holding a tissue under the bottom lashes and closing her eyes, then rolling a cotton bud dipped in cleanser over the lashes, wiping away the mascara onto the tissue. The practical side proved trickier, but with practice, she improved. The girls told her to remember that makeup should accentuate inner beauty, not exaggerate it. They advised her to keep it natural at first and, as she gained more experience, she would learn techniques for things like smoky eyes. Sierra wanted to remind them that this experience would end the moment she got back home, but somehow the words didn't come out. Hair was easier, after all, she had often played with her sister's hair. The girls quickly granted her a passing grade in that department and focused instead on becoming Sierra's personal Trini and Susanna, just like on TV. Despite their claims of not wanting to dress Sierra, it seemed they just didn't want to do it in the mornings. Before long, they had planned her wardrobe for the week. She would look pretty, feminine, and sexy. Maybe a little too sexy for her liking, but, being who she was, she decided to submit to their better judgment. Now, all she had to do was think like a girl and be a girl. The rest of the night was spent adjusting her perspective. Chapter 11, Dancing Queen. The next few days passed in a blur. Sierra really began to bond with the girls, especially Orla and Fiona. She grew to enjoy the college and its activities, and gradually, with the constant use of Irish, her thinking started to shift. Where before she had to consciously translate from Irish to English in her mind, now the language came naturally. It flowed through her thoughts, more fluid, more artistic, even romantic and musical. It was becoming second nature to her. She even found herself dreaming in Irish. What Sierra didn't notice was that the shift wasn't just in her language. More and more, Sierra was becoming her true self. Her mannerisms were changing, her hands now flowed with the rhythm of the native tongue. She mirrored the other girls' intonations in speech, automatically copying their movements. And in those Irish dreams, a young girl danced. Sierra felt freer now to express her sensitive, caring side. Where Sean had always repressed his feelings, Sierra shared hers openly for the benefit of everyone around her. She was quick to catch on to things, always ready to help, whether it was with tricky Irish grammar or lending a hand in craft class. She was fast becoming a favorite among the girls and her instructors. She even landed her first starring role. Naam Brid and Naam Podrick had a series of communal events, one of which was a traditional dance show, a sort of amateur river dance. The girls had been practicing hard all week, competing for the leading roles. Ain, the class queen bee, had herself pegged for the part. It seemed to be hers for the taking. She was already planning her moments on stage with the boys from Podrick's. The dance teacher asked if anyone else was interested in competing for the title of dancing queen. None of the girls seemed to be stepping up until Orla threw the shy and reserved Sierra's bonnet into the ring. Sierra had mentioned in their getting-to-know-you session that she was a champion Irish dancer. She'd never had the famous ringlets, but that wasn't a lie. Her mother had known the local teacher, and Sierra and her sisters had been trained for free. Sean had even been included, with the teachers telling him that it would improve his football. The only boy in the group, he received special attention and had medals to prove his skill. For the first time in a setting with her peers, Sierra began to dance without fear of ridicule. Like everything else this past week, it felt so natural. Ain had been good, but Sierra was better. She finished to universal applause, though Ain responded with a slow clap. The Ice Queen had been dethroned by the newest princess. Sierra was going to take the stage. Friday night was her big debut. The hall was filled with students from both the boys' and girls' colleges, along with their mentors. Sierra waited backstage, nervous but excited. For the first time dancing, she would indeed have the coveted ringlets. She was also beautifully adorned with a tiara and a stunning dress with a Celtic motif, a magical creation from Mrs. O'Brien. She felt special, tingly, her heart fluttering. She truly felt like the queen she looked. Mr. Clancy appeared backstage with the boys and gave a whistle. "Told ya, lads, doesn't this way suit our beautiful Rose much better?" The boys laughed. Sierra rolled her eyes and gracefully moved away from the lecherous group. Already, she had had enough of boys. The production went off without a hitch. The girls performed in a troupe, followed by the boys. Then, Sierra tipped to the floor. She cleared her mind and let the music guide her. She didn't miss a beat, taking her final position and bowing to the crowd. The enthusiastic applause told her it had gone well. As she stood there, a tall, handsome boy tipped to the floor. She stayed in place as he danced his routine around her. He was also a skilled dancer. Sierra glanced to the side. Her housemates were transfixed by the boy, and Ain's lustful gaze was unmistakable. As the music reached a crescendo, she watched him approach. In a flash, he scooped her into his arms and planted a kiss on her lips. The music stopped, applause erupted, and flowers rained down on them. Sierra's cheeks burned with heat. She had just had her first kiss, and it was with a boy. Chapter 12, One of Our Own. The after-show refreshments were a blur. Sierra was still reeling from the shock. Her Casanova had made several attempts to get closer, but she had managed to dodge them so far, thanks to the girls, especially Ain, who had been quick to take her place. Fiona and Orla, however, managed to catch the star and were eager to quiz her. But for the first time, her command of Irish seemed to let her down. As the evening drew to a close, Sierra said her goodbyes to the girls, who were heading back to their house. She waved them off and made her way toward her own. Just as she turned the corner of the hall, she was suddenly pulled to one side and shoved to the ground. The familiar feeling of dread returned to her stomach, one she hadn't experienced since Sierra's arrival. "Well, what have we here, slut?" A spit landed in her ringlets, and she instantly recognized the shoes from which it had come. She had even complimented them earlier. But this moment was about to show her that not all the girls were fond of her. Ain and her sidekick were about to teach her that being a nice girl could also bring enemies. A vicious yank on her hair caused tears to prick at her eyes. "Think it's time we taught this trollop a lesson, don't you?" one of them sneered. "Dirty whore," the other added. "We should strip the bitch and send her home like the madam she clearly is." Sierra felt a zip and heard her head scream. Stars danced before her eyes, and she was starting to lose consciousness. Not only were these girls planning to humiliate her, but they were also about to discover her secret. Just as she was about to succumb to the darkness, she heard another voice, "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Sierra's heart leaped. In fact, I'd be very careful about how you handle one of my girls. We're like sisters, see, and I don't take kindly to anyone touching one of our own. Isn't that right, girls? Sierra lifted her head to see Sinead and several of her classmates stepping forward, confronting the bullies. Get em! The weight lifted from Sierra's shoulders, and she stood just in time to see her tormentors fleeing down the hill, chased by a group of determined girls. Every step they took brought them closer to their targets, but the bullies made a break for the next field, looking as though they might escape. Just as the tension began to ease, Sierra felt comforting arms around her. She was safe. Then, suddenly, they heard the sound of machinery followed by bursts of laughter. Two figures, soaked and covered in muck, emerged from the scene like two brown, drenched versions of Carrie. "Go Bordia or in!" Mrs. O'Brien called out. "What on earth were you doing there, girls?" She climbed off the tractor, her face a mix of disbelief and amusement. The muck spreader was still working, just ask Ain. Chapter 13, Just Rewards. Saturday was a free day, and Sierra was woken by a call from Orla. Word had spread about the ordeal the night before, and Orla wanted to check in on her friend. She also had news. Ain, still reeking of muck, had been spotted boarding the bus home instead of heading to town for shopping. That led her to the real reason for the call. Her mother had phoned and wanted to take Sierra and her friends into town for a treat. Orla, being an only child, was accustomed to her mother lavishing gifts on her, and she certainly had more money than she knew what to do with. "Get ready," Orla said. "Fiona and I will pick you up in half an hour. We're hitting the shops." It wasn't just shopping that they indulged in. Orla's mother regaled her friends with tales of how lovely Sierra had been all week, helping Orla with everything and recounting the unfortunate events of the previous night. Secretly, her heart ached for the impoverished background Sierra came from, but she didn't want to bring that up. She simply wanted to give Sierra a little joy. She booked them into a beauty salon, where they were treated to the works. Sierra was overwhelmed by the attention. But as the earring gun popped, she had a sudden realization that maybe this was all a bit much, and certainly a bit permanent. After all, there was a boy at home who would have to explain this. But by the time the second pop rang in her ear, she looked at her newly styled and highlighted hair. It was a little too late for second thoughts. She'd crossed that bridge when she came to it. Next, they hit the local boutiques. Sierra tried to protest, but with each "suits you" and "that's fabulous," she found herself with another bag to carry. In fact, she ended up needing to buy a new bag for all the things she'd acquired. By the time they returned to the house, she had nearly enough clothes to replace the ones she'd borrowed, but still, she had somehow maintained a chic, feminine style. Sean, it seemed, had gotten lost somewhere along the way. Chapter 14, Trath na Gesiest. The remaining days of the stay flew by. Sierra had never felt so content and happy. She knew she would deeply miss her new life and the friends she had made. Each day brought new joy, laughter, and memories, and before long, it was the middle of the final week. Wednesday evening brought them back to the hall, where they would face off against the boys of Naam Podrig once again. It was tradition that the boys and girls competed in a Trath na Gesiest, a high-stakes quiz, every year. The final Friday would bring the Cayley Moore, a grand dance, and the winning team had the privilege of watching the losers serve them and clean up for the night. As far as anyone could remember, the boys had always been victorious. However, the results might have had more to do with the question master, Mr. Clancy, who had been setting the questions for as long as anyone could recall. The teams squared off, starting with general knowledge. Both teams performed well initially, with the girls pulling ahead by a slight margin. As the rounds went on, their lead grew more commanding. Fiona, a music and film buff, helped the team score highly in those rounds. By the time the last round of individual questions arrived, the girls only needed 2 more points to secure victory. Mr. Clancy announced the topic, sport. Sport. No problem, the girls were as knowledgeable as the boys when it came to that, and surely they would get the 2 points they needed to win. The round began, and the first girl, Lucy, missed her question. No matter, they still had plenty of chances. The boys, however, answered their questions with surprising ease. Sinead followed, and she aced hers. Only one more point needed. The next boy answered correctly. As the questions grew more obscure, however, the boys seemed to have a clear advantage, answering with knowledge that seemed to have been bestowed upon them. Mr. Clancy worked his way through the teams, and Sierra, as the girls' captain, would be answering the final question. When it came to her turn, the teams were tied. She had the last question. Mr. Clancy began, "So be eine Captain for Anpil and Kyrie in 1985? Who was the Kerry football captain in 1985? Sierra could hear the girls groan, and the boys' smug smiles spread across the hall. The question suddenly brought her thoughts back to her dad, and for a moment, she felt a wave of shame and emotion. She wished he could see her now. Mr. Clancy called again for an answer. She remembered memorizing the names of the Kerry greats. She knew the answer. "Pidi Osei," she replied. Mr. Clancy's jaw dropped. "What? How?" "Pidi Osei, I saw him on the Rose of Tralee once," Sierra quipped, shrugging off her shame. "Ta and cert agate." "You're correct." She had gotten it right. The girls erupted into cheers, and Miss Sullivan let out a cheer as well. The boys were left bickering about who would be wearing the rubber gloves. As the girls surrounded her, celebrating their victory, Sierra spotted the dancer. He winked at her and made his way out of the hall. Chapter 15, Kaylee Moore. Friday was chaos. The house was in a frenzy, with all the girls preparing for the dance. There was almost bloodshed over hot water, and you could lose a limb trying to claim some mirror space. Earlier in the day, Orla had stopped by with one final surprise from her mom. Sierra eagerly opened it to find her very first little black kitten dress. "Every girl should have one," the note read. She pulled it out and hugged it to her chest. It was beautiful, and for a moment, she felt just like a princess. It might be her last night as a girl, but she intended to enjoy every second of it. The hall buzzed with excitement and a bittersweet sadness. For many, it would be the last time they saw their new friends. Phone numbers were exchanged, and hugs and tears flowed freely. Sierra and her friends had already swapped the important details, making sure to have one last night of fun. It was time to bring the house down. The girls and boys lined up, just like old Ireland, boys on one side, girls on the other. The music started, and the dances followed. Everyone had gotten quite good at Kaylee dancing during their stay. It wasn't particularly sexy, but it was fun. Sierra was relieved on that front. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but now it was obvious, one tall dancer seemed to be stalking her. Her friends noticed too, and it sparked giggles. After a shy introduction, they retreated to the ladies' room. "He's cute, but I don't want to break his heart," Sierra joked, but the girls insisted she go for it. When they returned, the stage was filling up. This part of the night was less exciting, speeches. Various organizers spoke, sponsors were thanked, and credits were given. The college principal then announced something new for the year. A generous donor had set up a prize for Student of the Year. The winner's school would receive a scholarship for the next year, and the student would get €500 to spend however they liked. Sierra's thoughts instantly drifted to what her mum could do with that money. She was still lost in that daydream when her name was announced as the winner. Luckily, she had tidied herself up for the local newspaper photo. She started the night as a princess and ended it as a queen. Congratulations poured in for the rest of the evening. Questions swirled: would the money go on CDs, makeup, or clothes? Sierra could barely take it all in. Finally, her unwanted admirer approached to offer his congratulations, catching her off guard with a peck on the cheek. "Now I know where you're from, princess," he joked. "I've got an aunt who lives there. Maybe you'll give me a call sometime?" He smiled, placed a note in her trembling hand, and kissed her goodbye. "See you around, babe." Sierra was speechless, while her courtesans were in a state of delirium. Chapter 16, Return of the Queen. The day of departure finally arrived, and Sierra had never felt so sad. She never knew she could cry so much. She would miss Mrs. O'Brien, the fun, and, most of all, her new friends. Orla and Fiona had come by before leaving, promising to meet again. It was heartbreaking. Sierra cried like a baby as she waved them goodbye. Would she ever see them again, let alone Orla and Fiona? The tears wouldn't stop. As she boarded the bus, it was in the comforting arms of her classmates, and with a heavy heart filled with sadness and anxiety about what lay ahead, she let the tears flow all the way home. When the bus finally pulled into the schoolyard, Sierra wiped her eyes. It felt good to be home, she supposed, but then she remembered, it wasn't her home. It was Sean's home. Fate awaited her at the bottom of the coach steps. Everyone had disembarked, and it was time to face reality. Into the breach. As she stepped off the bus, the now familiar sound of applause greeted her. The school principal, her mom, aunt, cousin, and sisters were all there to meet her. She found herself caught in a massive group hug. The tears flowed again. Her aunt broke the silence. "I always knew you'd better yourself, Colleen. When Cora told me, I knew you'd be divine." "Cora? Ms. Sullivan?" Things started clicking into place. She mock-scolded her aunt, but there was a hint of gratitude in her voice. A photographer interrupted the moment as he snapped a picture of her with her teachers and family for the local paper. So much for keeping Sierra's secret. There went her hopes of keeping her transformation under wraps. So much for bringing glory to the school. As the travelers began to disperse, the principal thanked the girls for the honor they'd brought to the school and wished them a safe journey home. "We've got something special planned for Monday," she said. "Be there bright and early." She paused, a mischievous smile forming. "And Sinead, that means in uniform and skirt." Laughter erupted, and Sinead snorted. "You too, Sierra," she called, leading the cheers. It seemed Sierra wasn't quite done with skirts just yet.